After 3 decades of diplomatic service across the globe, Ambassador Jonathan Taylor was ready for a quiet life. He had spent his career navigating tense negotiations, brokering peace deals, and managing crises that spanned continents. Now, he wanted nothing more than to cultivate the rare crops he had collected from the farthest corners of the earth, plants with medicinal, environmental, and agricultural significance that could change the world. When he first laid eyes on the property in Maple Ridge Estates, he knew it was perfect. It had a sprawling backyard with rich soil, a warm climate, and, most importantly, privacy. The thought of finally having the time to grow his collection of rare heritage crops filled him with excitement. These weren't just any plants. They were part of an ongoing United Nations biodiversity project. Species that could help combat climate change, famine, and even certain diseases. As he worked tirelessly on his dream garden, Ambassador Taylor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Each plant had a story. A purple Afghan carrot that thrived in drought conditions, a medicinal Peruvian bean that boosts immunity, a delicate blue Himalayan poppy thought to be extinct. This wasn't just a retirement hobby. It was a living, breathing piece of global history. But peace is a fragile thing. And Ambassador Taylor was about to learn that the greatest battles weren't fought in embassies or war rooms. They were fought in the manicured lawns and board meetings of HOA tyrants. The trouble started with a shadow falling over his garden one late afternoon. He was on his knees, gently inspecting the leaves of a rare Himalayan herb, when a sharp, clipped voice sliced through the stillness. "Excuse me," the voice said, laced with authority. Taylor looked up, squinting against the sun, to see a woman standing at his fence. Eleanor Whitfield, HOA president. She was pristine and unyielding, her pearl necklace catching the afternoon light, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Those garden boxes are against our rules," she announced. Taylor wiped his hands on his jeans, rising to meet her gaze. "Good afternoon, Eleanor," he said smoothly, though he already recognized a storm brewing in her stiff posture. "Actually, raised garden beds are permitted under Section 4.3 of the bylaws. I made sure before I built them." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, just enough to betray her irritation. "Maybe so, but the plants inside them are unsightly. The HOA board expects manicured lawns, not whatever this is." She gestured toward his carefully cultivated crops, as if they were a blight upon the neighborhood. Taylor smiled tightly, the diplomat in him taking over. "These are heritage vegetables, Eleanor," he said, keeping his tone even. "Some of them are nearly extinct. That one there is a purple carrot from Afghanistan, perfect for arid climates. And over here—" "Ambassador Taylor," Eleanor interrupted with a sigh, as if he were a child explaining why it colored outside the lines. "I don't care if they're magic beans from the moon. They look messy, and several neighbors have complained." Taylor's smile didn't falter. "Which neighbors?" he asked. Eleanor ignored the question. "The board meets next Thursday. I suggest you clean this up before then, or we'll have to take official action." She turned on her heel and strode away, leaving Taylor staring after her. Something in the way she lingered just a second too long made his instincts tingle. This wasn't just about property values. This was personal. And Eleanor Whitfield wasn't done with him. That night, Taylor sat in his study, reviewing briefings for an upcoming UN climate summit, when his phone buzzed. A text from Victor, his quiet neighbor. "Watch out for Eleanor. She targeted my bird sanctuary last year. Had to remove it after $900 in fines." Taylor exhaled, rubbing his temples. This was a pattern. Eleanor wasn't enforcing rules. She was hunting for control. And Taylor knew how to handle people like her. The next morning, he requested a formal meeting with Douglas Montgomery, the HOA vice president. If Eleanor was the face of Maple Ridge's authoritarian rule, Douglas was its bureaucratic enforcer. They met at the community center, where Douglas, a man with polished silver hair and the confidence of someone who never heard no, greeted him with a practiced smile. "Ambassador Taylor, I understand you've had a distinguished career," Douglas began. "But rules are rules. No exceptions." Taylor leaned forward, unruffled. "Then let's talk about rules," he said, opening his laptop. "Because Section 8.2 of the bylaws explicitly allows for sustainability initiatives and environmental conservation projects. My garden qualifies. Douglas's smile faltered just slightly before he masked it. Well, our concern is property values. Taylor clicked to a photo of malnourished children in drought-ravaged villages. And my concern is feeding people. Douglas shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing this was not an ordinary homeowner dispute. But as Taylor left the meeting, he spotted Eleanor watching from a distance. Her expression wasn't anger. It was calculation. Something told him she wasn't about to let this go. That night, Taylor sat outside on his porch, staring at the dark silhouettes of his crops swaying in the wind. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Victor. They're watching you. Be careful. Taylor's gaze drifted to the street. A pair of figures stood at the edge of his lawn. Eleanor and Douglas. They weren't talking. They were taking photos. A cold weight settled in his stomach. He had dealt with warlords, corrupt politicians, and double-crossing diplomats. But this was something different. And for the first time, Taylor wondered if he had underestimated them. The next morning, Taylor opened his front door to find a crisp white envelope taped to his mailbox. Violation notice. Unapproved landscaping modifications. Signed by Douglas Montgomery. He barely had time to process it before his phone rang. His assistant from the UN. Ambassador Taylor. Just confirming the Secretary General's visit next week. He's excited to see the Heritage Crop Project. Taylor's fingers tightened around the violation notice. A global leader was flying in to see a garden that an HOA was now trying to erase. It was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. Eleanor and Douglas had no idea who they were messing with, and they were about to find out. The violation notice felt heavier than a mere piece of paper. It was a declaration of war. Taylor was no stranger to conflicts, but he had always preferred diplomacy over retaliation. His instinct told him that this battle with the HOA needed to be handled with precision, not anger. So, instead of reacting, he planned. Later that day, he requested a second meeting with Douglas Montgomery. This time, he brought evidence. The HOA bylaws, photographic proof of compliant gardens in the neighborhood, and documents verifying his garden status as a UN-backed research site. The meeting was set for 3 p.m. at the community center. When he arrived, Douglas was already seated at the head of the long, polished table, flipping through some papers with a well-practiced air of authority. Taylor placed his laptop on the table, opened a slideshow, and calmly began his presentation. Douglas, I respect the HOA's rules, but my garden is fully compliant under Section 8.2, which supports sustainability initiatives. Furthermore, these crops are part of a UN initiative. Some of them are currently being studied for use in food-scarce regions. Douglas leaned back, a polite but disinterested expression on his face. That's all well and good, Ambassador, but we have a duty to our community. Your garden, regardless of its importance, is unconventional. Our residents expect uniformity. Taylor clicked to a photo of starving children in arid regions of Africa, where a variation of one of his plants had already begun saving lives. And I expect solutions to global hunger, he countered, voice calm but firm. Douglas cleared his throat, his smile tightening. I understand your passion, he said, but Eleanor has documented multiple violations. The board will make its decision next week. Taylor closed his laptop without another word. Douglas had just made a tactical error. He had underestimated who he was dealing with. This wasn't some retiree's backyard hobby. This was international research. And Taylor wasn't going to sit back and let small-minded HOA tyrants destroy years of scientific progress. As Taylor walked home from a meeting, his instinct screamed at him. Something wasn't right. His first clue came when he saw Eleanor and Douglas standing at the edge of his lawn again, whispering. This time, they weren't just observing. They were taking pictures. Taylor pulled out his phone and pretended to check his messages, snapping a discreet photo of them. When he reached his porch, Victor was already there, waiting. They've been watching your house all week, Victor said, arms crossed. Last night, Douglas was snooping around your fence with a flashlight. Taylor's jaw tightened. It was time to start watching back. That night, he installed a small, discreet security camera overlooking his garden. The footage would upload to a cloud storage system, insurance in case things escalated. And something told him they would. As he finished setting up the last camera, his phone buzzed again. A text from his assistant at the UN. Ambassador, the Secretary General is looking forward to seeing the crops next week. Everything on track. Taylor looked at the rows of thriving plants, feeling a chill creep up his spine. If Eleanor and Douglas were planning something, he needed to know before it was too late. Taylor had been away for only 3 days. A last-minute emergency meeting in Geneva had pulled him from Maple Ridge Estates. He had reluctantly left, knowing Victor was keeping an eye on things. But nothing could have prepared him for what he returned to. As his car turned onto a street, he saw Victor standing at the edge of his driveway, face grim. Ambassador, you need to see this, Victor said quietly. Taylor stepped into his backyard and felt his stomach drop. His once thriving garden was dead. Every plant had withered into twisted husks, their leaves brown and brittle, the soil reeking of chemicals. Taylor knelt, running his fingers through the tainted earth, anger boiling beneath his calm exterior. Who did this? He whispered. Victor pulled out his phone, tapping the screen. I caught it all on video. The footage was clear. Eleanor and Douglas, wearing gloves and masks, spraying his crops with a toxic substance in the dead of night. Taylor felt something cold settle in his chest. This wasn't just about property values. This was deliberate destruction. They had trespassed, vandalized, and ruined years of research without a second thought. They had no idea what they had just done, but they were about to find out. Taylor barely slept that night. His mind raced through legal ramifications, international treaties, and what this meant for his UN project. By morning, he had a plan. Step 1, secure the evidence. Victor uploaded the security footage to multiple locations, ensuring nothing could be deleted or tampered with. Step 2, test the soil. Taylor sent samples to the UN Environmental Research Team, suspecting that whatever poison was used had deeper consequences than just killing plants. Step 3, confront the HOA. At precisely 9 a.m., his doorbell rang. Eleanor stood at his doorstep, Douglas beside her, both wearing smug expressions. Ambassador Taylor, Eleanor said sweetly, we notice you finally removed that eyesore. The board appreciates your cooperation. Taylor didn't smile. Instead, he pulled out his phone and hit play. The video footage of them trespassing, spraying poison, destroying United Nations research project, played loud and clear. Eleanor's face drained of color. Douglas took a half step back, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. That's an invasion of privacy. Eleanor sputtered. Taylor's voice was calm, but lethal. No, Eleanor. Poisoning a garden tied to international food security is the real crime here. Do you have any idea what you've done? Douglas recovered quickly, adjusting his tie. Look, this is all a misunderstanding. The HOA had full authority. Taylor cut him off with a single sentence. I called the UN Secretary General this morning. Douglas paled. What? Eleanor whispered. Taylor held up a folder. This garden wasn't just mine. It belonged to the United Nations Global Seed Preservation Initiative. You destroyed protected agricultural specimens. Some of these plants existed nowhere else in the Western Hemisphere. Eleanor looked like she was going to be sick. Taylor stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. And tomorrow morning, an international team is arriving to assess the damage. Silence. For the first time, Eleanor had nothing to say. And then, the sound of tires screeching outside. Taylor turned just as a black SUV with diplomatic plates pulled up in front of his house. A woman in a dark suit stepped out, his chief security officer. Ambassador Taylor, she said, I and the HOA board members with cold suspicion. Is everything all right? We've been briefed on the situation. Taylor turned back to Eleanor and Douglas. You poisoned a garden. You thought it was just about property values. His voice was calm, unwavering. Now, it's an international incident. Silence stretched between Ambassador Jonathan Taylor and the two HOA leaders as his chief security officer, Maria Vasquez, stepped forward. The sleek black SUV with diplomatic plates behind her was more than just a car. It was a warning. Eleanor looked like she might faint, gripping her clipboard so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Douglas swallowed hard, his mask of smugness slipping. Ambassador Taylor, Maria said, nodding in greeting before turning to Eleanor and Douglas. These are the individuals responsible? Taylor nodded. Yes. Maria folded her arms, her tone calm but firm. Then we have a serious problem. The destruction of protected agricultural specimens from a UN Global Seed Preservation Initiative is not just an HOA dispute. It's a matter of international law. Douglas tried to recover, adjusting his tie. Let's be reasonable here. This is a simple misunderstanding. Taylor's gaze remained icy. A misunderstanding? He gestured toward his ruined garden, the wilted plants turning to ash in the poisoned soil. You trespassed. You poisoned plants that are part of global food security research. Some of these species are nowhere else in the world. Do you have any idea what you've done? Eleanor finally snapped out of her shock. You're blowing this out of proportion, Jonathan. Her voice trembled, but still held that edge of entitlement. This is just a garden. A messy, ugly garden. The board had full authority to act. Taylor held up his phone. With one tap, the security footage played again. Douglas and Eleanor's faces were illuminated by the screen, their own images betraying them. Spraying toxic chemicals over his crops, laughing as they did it. Maria's expression darkened. We've already sent this evidence to the State Department and UN legal teams, she said. And let me be clear, this isn't just about a garden. This is about willful destruction of international property, potential violations of conservation treaties, and criminal trespassing. Eleanor stumbled back, her pearl necklace gleaming against her now pale skin. Douglas exhaled slowly. There must be something we can do to resolve this, quietly. Maria raised an eyebrow. The UN Secretary General is arriving tomorrow morning. You can discuss it with him. Eleanor let out a strangled gasp. Douglas's hands curled into fists. The Secretary General? Over some plants. Taylor's smile was as cold as steel. Over a $53,000 research project that could have saved lives. The HOA's petty revenge had just turned into an international scandal. Taylor wasn't done yet. He left Eleanor and Douglas standing there, their world crumbling, and walked inside. Phone already pressed his ear. His call connected within seconds. State Department, this is Ambassador Taylor. We have a situation. Within hours, the wheels of international diplomacy were turning. The UN legal team was reviewing the footage. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, was contacted to analyze the poisoned soil. The FBI was informed. Because if the HOA had violated international conservation laws, it could have serious legal consequences. By evening, news had already started leaking. A journalist from the Washington Post called his office, asking about an environmental crime linked to an HOA in Maple Ridge Estates. It was spreading. And as Taylor sat in his study, watching his destroyed garden under the moonlight, he knew this battle was just beginning. Because now, it wasn't just about his plants. It was about taking down a corrupt system. The next morning, at exactly 9 a.m., the HOA board arrived at Taylor's doorstep. Eleanor was smiling again, though it didn't reach her eyes. Douglas stood beside her, looking too calm for a man about to face an international reckoning. Ambassador Taylor, Eleanor said sweetly, we understand you've had some concerns. We're here to discuss a resolution. Taylor didn't invite them in. Instead, he folded his arms. You mean you're here to stop this from becoming public? Douglas chuckled, shaking his head. Let's be real, Ambassador. This is a neighborhood dispute. No one actually cares about some old vegetables. We're offering you a deal. Let's put this behind us. Taylor didn't blink. I'm listening. Eleanor pulled a small envelope from her bag and handed it to him. A check. Taylor unfolded it. $500. His laugh was cold and humorless. You poisoned $53,000 worth of crops, and you think I'll sell for $500? Eleanor tilted her chin up. It's a fair offer. Take it, and we all move on. Taylor leaned forward, his voice quiet but lethal. Eleanor, you don't seem to understand. This isn't about money anymore. The Secretary General will be here in a few hours. The media is already circling. You're not getting out of this. Douglas's mask finally cracked. This is getting out of hand, Ambassador. His voice was low. Warning. You're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. Taylor's smile didn't waver. You already made it a big deal. I'm just giving it the attention it deserves. The HOA leaders turned stone-faced, realizing their power was slipping. Taylor shut the door in their faces. At 11:30 a.m., just as Taylor was finishing a call with the UN legal team, he heard the sound of approaching vehicles. Through his front window, he saw a convoy of black SUVs pulling up, followed by news vans and reporters with cameras. The Secretary General had arrived. Within minutes, his security team escorted him inside, shaking Taylor's hand. Ambassador Taylor, show me what happened to our plants. Together, they walked into the ruined garden, where scientists were already taking soil samples. The Secretary General's jaw tightened as he looked over the devastation. Who did this? He asked, voice low. Taylor handed him the evidence folder. Eleanor and Douglas were about to face something far worse than angry homeowners. They were about to face the weight of the global stage. At 12:15 p.m., a CNN reporter went live from a neighborhood. We are reporting from Maple Ridge Estates, where a Homeowners Association has allegedly poisoned a United Nations research garden. The plants, part of the Global Food Security Initiative, were valued at over $53,000. The HOA is now facing potential federal investigation. Eleanor's name was everywhere. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, watching as cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed, and the entire country learned the depths of HOA corruption. Inside his house, Taylor watched the coverage, feeling a sense of grim satisfaction. They had tried to bully him into submission. Instead, they had just destroyed their own reputations. As the media storm raged, Victor ran up to Taylor's porch, a folder in hand. Ambassador, you need to see this. Taylor opened the folder. Inside were confidential HOA documents, plans for a real estate project labeled Pinewood Luxury Condominiums. A map showed several properties marked for acquisition. His house? Circled in red. Priority target. Taylor felt his pulse slow and cold. They poisoned my garden, he murmured, scanning the documents, because they wanted me gone. And now they were going to pay. Taylor's fingers tightened around the confidential HOA documents Victor had handed him. The real estate development plans, the highlighted homes marked for forced acquisition, and the circled red target around his property. This wasn't just about HOA enforcement. This was a full-scale scam, and it was time to bring the full force of the law down on them. His phone was already in his hand before he even realized it. Agent Williams, this is Ambassador Taylor. I have something you're going to want to see. Within 30 minutes, 2 unmarked FBI vehicles pulled up in front of his house. Several agents stepped out, their expressions grim as they took the files from Taylor. We've had our eyes on Douglas Montgomery for a while, Agent Williams admitted as he flipped through the documents. We suspected he was engaged in fraud, but we didn't have concrete proof. Until now. Taylor leaned forward, his voice cold. They poisoned my land to force me out. This wasn't just petty HOA politics. It was criminal. Williams nodded. We'll take it from here. As the agents left, Taylor felt a cold sense of satisfaction. Eleanor and Douglas had played their game too long. Now it was his turn. 8 escape and arrests. At 3:45 p.m., the HOA board held a closed-door emergency meeting, or at least that's what Eleanor and Douglas thought they were doing. Instead, half the neighborhood showed up. Word had spread fast about the FBI's presence, the real estate scam, and the truth about the HOA's years of corruption. Angry homeowners gathered in front of the community center, blocking the exits as news cameras rolled. Inside, Douglas paced furiously, checking his phone. Eleanor sat rigidly, hands clenched around her pearl necklace, like a lifeline. They're bluffing, Douglas hissed. The FBI can't just... The doors burst open. Federal agents flooded the room. Douglas Montgomery. Eleanor Whitfield. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, destruction of protected agricultural property, and violations of federal environmental laws. The room exploded in chaos. Eleanor screeched, shoving back her chair. Douglas tried to bolt for the side exit, but 2 agents tackled him to the ground before he made it 3 steps. Cameras flashed as the FBI dragged them both out in handcuffs. The crowd cheered. This is an outrage. Eleanor shrieked as she was shoved into the back of a patrol car. I was only enforcing the rules. Taylor stepped forward, looking down at her. Rules? His voice was lethal in its calmness. You poisoned an international research project. You thought you were powerful, Eleanor, but you just learned a hard lesson. Real power doesn't come from rules. It comes from justice. She snapped her head away, refusing to look at him. It didn't matter. She was finished. As the FBI processed Eleanor and Douglas, Taylor and Victor met with Agent Williams in a secure location. We found something disturbing, Williams said, sliding over a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a USB drive recovered from Eleanor's home. Taylor plugged it into his laptop. What he saw made his blood freeze. Encrypted emails, bank statements, documents linking Douglas's real estate company to foreign investors with government ties. Taylor's hands tightened into fists. He recognized one of the names. A former diplomat from a foreign nation notorious for funding real estate acquisitions near U.S. government properties. Victor exhaled sharply. This wasn't just about condos. They were buying up land for something bigger. Taylor nodded. And my land was the final piece. Williams shut the laptop. This just became a national security case. We need to notify Washington. Taylor rubbed his temples. This was no longer just about HOA corruption. This was something far more dangerous. 3 weeks later, Maple Ridge Estates was transformed. With the HOA dissolved and Eleanor and Douglas facing serious charges, the remaining board members voted unanimously to turn control of the neighborhood over to the residents. The toxic soil in Taylor's garden was being restored, thanks to environmental specialists from the UN. What was once a graveyard of dead plants was now a symbol of resilience. And miraculously, amidst the poisoned soil, a single plant had survived. A small, delicate Himalayan blue poppy, one of the rarest species in the world. Taylor knelt beside it, brushing his fingers over the fragile petals. Against all odds, it lived, Victor said behind him. Taylor smiled. Sometimes, the strongest things grow in the worst conditions. The neighborhood had learned the same lesson. Where once there was fear, now there was community. Neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak out against Eleanor and Douglas now worked together to build something better. A community garden. A neighborhood free from abuse. Justice had prevailed, but the fight wasn't over yet. 1 month later, Taylor stood before Congress, giving his official testimony on the dangers of unchecked HOA power and foreign real estate influence. Lawmakers from both parties listened intently as he presented the evidence. This isn't just about one corrupt HOA, he said. This is about ensuring that no American homeowner is ever again bullied, defrauded, or targeted in their own community. The hearing made national headlines. Laws were proposed. HOA regulations were put under a microscope. The battle Taylor had started was now a movement. Back in Maple Ridge Estates, the community garden flourished. And one morning, Taylor woke up to find a small plaque mounted near his restored crops. It read, "Ambassador of Plants and People. Sometimes the worst poison reveals the strongest roots." Taylor smiled, running his fingers over the metal engraving. Eleanor and Douglas had tried to destroy him. Instead, they had helped him grow something even greater. Justice, community, a legacy, and that was worth far more than $53,000.